we have popcorn tonight. And the video you've all been demanding. Today, we are going to do a popcorn review of Digital Hammurabi here on Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Okay, we are going to do a popcorn review of the most recent MythVision YouTube video, Does Archaeology Bury the Bible? On this, Derek Lambert interviews Dr. Joshua Bowen, who's better known as Digital Hammurabi. Now, who is Dr. Josh Bowen? He holds a PhD in Assyriology and a Master of Arts in Near Eastern Studies, both from Johns Hopkins University. He also has a Master's of Theology from Capital Bible Seminary, and he holds a Bachelor of Science, yes, a Bachelor of Science in Religion from Liberty University. So his background is that he is a Christian fundamentalist. He comes from a Christian fundamentalist background. And like many Christian fundamentalists who have gone to university, he lost his faith and is now an outspoken critic of the Bible. So what we're going to do today is we are going to look at this interview and put it through the popcorn reaction test and see, does archaeology indeed bury the Bible, or is Dr. Joshua Bowen just blowing smoke? So let's get into it.
Ladies and gentlemen, get the book Dr. Joshua Bowen wrote.
Yes, that is Joshua Bowen's book, The Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament. It's also self-published, as most of his books are self-published. This is not a book that went through a lot of peer review in all likelihood. If he's publishing it himself, usually that means he can't get it published elsewhere. So already I'm just taking what he says with the proverbial grain of salt. So just because you have a book doesn't mean it's got the backing of a publishing house or it's been through peer review, and that alone should serve as a warning. But the host of MythVision here, Derek Lambert, is pitching Josh Bowen's book. So let's get into the interview here and let's see, does Bowen manage to bury the Bible with archaeology?
The Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament. It is extremely full of knowledge and information for anyone.
Yeah, like you would know.
As well as join the Patreon. There's hundreds of
That's
videos
an unqualified
that have not
opinion
released to the internet. You can ask questions and I will record them with these scholars in high definition. I do that all the time. You can also personal message me and you help the community grow. Thanks a lot. Dr. Joshua Bowen, I'm going to try to ask this as succinctly as possible. My patrons have been trained. Give me good criticisms about how to do this. So how does archaeology debunk, if I could use the term, or kind of cut through the biblical narrative?
Yeah, nothing like a little bit poisoning the well here to begin with. How does the archaeology debunk or cut through the biblical narrative? That's a loaded question right there.
So the Bible versus archaeology. Take us through the problem.
Yeah. So, I mean, sort of, and I guess as I answer, you can interject and develop or steer me where you want me to go. But
no bias here at all.
Here is, and again, I'm not an archaeologist. I've got a fair amount of archaeological training. I've been in archaeological excavation, but like there are professional archaeologists, so I want to be clear from the outset about that. But the information that I'll give is sort of consensus archaeological position. Okay.
I love how Josh Bowen just bandies about the word consensus thinking. Consensus position. Josh knows darn well that right now that there's a debate going on in the field of biblical archaeology. Biblical minimalism versus biblical maximalism. There's no consensus position right now. And that's going to be a problem because he's going to keep going, he's going to keep, hammering home, this is consensus thinking, this is consensus thinking. And consensus thinking has a technical definition. Consensus means that the issue, the matter, is resolved in the field. And this is anything but resolved. What we have here is an academic controversy. And academic controversies are the exact opposite of consensus thinking. But he loves to throw around that word consensus thinking. That consensus opinion. It's settled science. Just follow the settled science. Yeah. There are more biblical maximalist scholars today than there have been in the past 40 years. It hasn't gotten less controversial, it's gotten more controversial.
There is this idea, I think, among Christian apologists that if we can go to the Bible, which the Old Testament, for example, that we're starting off assuming that it's correct.
I have an issue here just with his target. He's focusing in on Christian apologists. But they're not the only players in this game. Okay? What about Christian scholars? Yes, we know that in the atheist community, oh, he's a Christian, therefore he can't be a scholar. He must be an apologist. Well, no. There are Christians who are also scholars, and scholars in this particular field. And they even work at mainstream universities. So, there's this whole idea that it's just apologists is incredibly condescending. It's incredibly condescending. And quite frankly, factually wrong.
And that what it's presenting is historically reliable. Then if we can go into different areas.
Yes, well, there are scholars who do hold to the reliability of, say, the scriptures. And it isn't just Christian scholars that do this. There's also Jewish scholars that do this, like Joshua Berman. He's an Orthodox Jew. And yet he claims the reliability of the Old Testament. So, that's not necessarily an assumption. In Joshua Berman's case, it wasn't an assumption. It was a conclusion. Okay? Not everyone who approaches the biblical text is assuming the truth of it. Many people are just concluding it after long diligent study. So I think he's painting with a very broad brush here. And he's doing it in very compressed language. He's very careful about his words. And I think that's something we should take very careful note of, is that he's not going to let you get by one sentence without some loaded terminology being inserted here or some sort of inference. So we have to be very, very careful how we in our approach to even listening to Josh, because he's very methodical. He takes his words very slow, but they're also very loaded.
Of investigation and find consistency with it. that lends greater and greater credibility to the thing that we already believe is historically reliable.
Yeah, he's essentially accusing Christian apologists, Christian scholars of circular reasoning. That's essentially what he's doing here. He's accusing his intellectual opponents of circular reasoning. We assume the Bible is true. We look at archaeological evidence. Says it's true. We've proved our assumption. Therefore, it's circular reasoning. There is a sense where, okay, yeah, if you do approach the text that way, yeah, you could end up with a possibility of circular reasoning. There's no doubt there. But that's not the only approach to the text. And while that may be true in fundamentalist circles, it's certainly not true of even, say, wider evangelical scholarship. It just isn't true. Because truth value of the scriptures isn't the only outcome to an archaeological investigation. And I think we'll get into that a little more as this progresses here.
So when you read something in the book of Daniel and it says Belshazzar, and 100 years ago, scholars are like, we don't know anything about any Belshazzar. And then archaeology pulls up, oh, here's Belshazzar. They're like, aha, see, it proves the Bible.
Right.
Okay. It's not really how that works.
Granted, one find that supports a detail of the Bible does not prove the entire Bible. But he's also sort of glossing over something as well here, which is that in the case of, say, Christian apologists, it's a reactive discipline. It reacts to challenges. Okay? He's being a little disingenuous here. In fact, he's being a lot disingenuous. Let's just throw out the charity here. He's being a lot disingenuous. He sort of glosses over that scholars 100 years ago were saying that the Bible is not true. Basically throwing out the whole baby with the bathwater here on the basis that they couldn't find Belshazzar in the cuneiform record. Well, now we have tablets from that reign, one of which is in the British Museum. So, if we reduce that scope from, well, the Bible's all wrong, and the Bible's all true, versus this detail is confirmed, then yes, it's valid. It's totally valid. But, at the same time, too, both approaches are wrong. Basically discarding the whole Bible because you find one detail that doesn't match your preconceived notions is no more valid than accepting the entire Bible as your notions of the Bible as valid because one detail works out. So in that respect, both approaches here are wrong. Just because the approach Josh is criticizing here is an invalid approach doesn't make his approach valid. It's just as invalid, just in the opposite way.
Because the goal of there's no goal of archaeology when it comes to proving or disproving the Bible. That's not like biblical archaeologists. They don't do that anymore.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
I've got a chapter in my book where I talk about sort of how biblical archaeology has evolved as a discipline. And before, that was really the point of biblical archaeology. It was to, either illuminate the biblical text or even in cases to defend it.
He is right that the origins of biblical archaeology were to either illuminate the biblical text or to prove it. Okay, that's true. There's no contest about that. This is one of the reasons why Egyptology made the big split from biblical archaeology, was because it wanted to get away from that kind of thinking. So he's absolutely right that used to be. But that's not the same as saying that, biblical archaeology can illuminate the parts of the biblical text. Or it can prove that certain sections have elements of truth. When I first went to university, my prof came to, out of that school that said that there was nothing true in the Bible at all. And I remember him saying that to me. There's nothing true in the Bible at all. Really? Nothing? We concede that other ancient Near Eastern texts have elements of truth, but there's nothing true at all in the Bible? That's a bias of a former generation. So, it's not quite true to say it cannot illuminate. It's just not the goal to illuminate.
And so even as late as like the 60s with people like William Albright, that he has this like basic idea that the Hebrew Bible is historically reliable. And so as we dig down into the ground, it's going to illuminate and confirm the historical reliability of the biblical text. Well, we're not there anymore. And the short answer why, or the short reason why, is that as they dig up more sites, it becomes clear that the timeline, the chronological, layout of the narrative that the Bible has doesn't match what we see coming up out of the ground.
Okay, I love here how Josh resorts to vague generalities. Nothing that comes out of the ground matches the biblical timeline. What biblical timeline? The fundamentalist biblical timeline? Mainstream evangelicalism's timeline? As far as I know, the Bible doesn't have a timeline. Timeline is an artificial construct that we have superimposed over the Bible. It's an interpretation. And it's an interpretation that changes, really, with particular religious traditions. The fundamentalists have, especially those that follow, say, American young earth creationism, have a particular timeline that is probably not valid, at least in some places. Is that the biblical timeline? Did, Moses and Jesus Christ put their stamp on that and say, this is the biblical timeline? No, of course not. That's just silly. No, there's no biblical timeline. Timelines are a reconstruction by scholars, chronologists, and historians to explain it. So, he's talking as if there's an authoritative biblical timeline. Well, there isn't. That's nonsense.
So, what is it that archaeology does? Well, William Deaver, I think, makes a really good case for archaeological data being primary evidence, primary data, in that it's not subjected or it's not subject to the biases that, for example, propagandistic textual pieces are subjected to.
If I may, just in what you're saying,
he slips in that propagandistic textual piece, the inference, the Bible. That's what he's trying to get at here. Okay? We are going to hold his feet to the fire on that one.
One who hears this that might be a Christian might automatically go, you're already trying to do that against the Bible. No. What you're actually saying is not just biblical. You're talking Sumerian, Akkadian, it doesn't matter what the context or what society. Archaeology is going to go with what the facts are on the ground and the evidence there. Now, sometimes stuff might be missing. Sometimes there's limits to what you can do. But texts that are propagandistic.
I love how Derek Lambert tries to save Josh's bacon here from the accusation of bias. But bias is all through this. It's really evident that there's a strong bias running through this whole thing.
Or potentially mythology, or the genre may not be literal. It might utilize people, places, things, etc., like that. you would be equally applying it to other cultures as well.
Absolutely. And this is the real issue. Let's take an example.
Okay, let's talk about that bias for a moment. Because Josh here wants to say that we're applying the same standards to the biblical texts as, say, for example, some ancient Sumerian or Akkadian text. I have yet to hear anyone go, well, how does archaeology debunk the Kadesh inscriptions? How does it debunk the Sea People's scene of Ramses III? How does biblical archaeology debunk the Sumerian kings list? No one's asking those questions. No one is asking those questions. So you are applying two different standards. One to the Bible, which you gotta debunk, because we all hate that. And every other ancient Near Eastern text. You've primed that bias already in.
Example with the third millennium, there's this big conflict that we know about, the Lagash border conflict. I talk about this in the book, in the history chapter. And the documents that we have that tell us about this border conflict between the city of and the city of Lagash are from Lagash, right? And they're inscriptions, they're these royal inscriptions that are from the vantage point, from the position of the kings of Lagash.
Mm-hmm.
So what you would expect to see is what we find. So if you read through, so to sort of very briefly lay this out, there is this field, or this grouping of fields that lie in between the city of and the city of Lagash in southern Mesopotamia. And they are they're in dispute between these, this is how cities work, right? You have people in the city and then the people that are in the hinterland, that are in the countryside, that are providing food and other necessities from agricultural products, and grazing areas for animal husbandry. So the steppe is really, really important to the city. Mm-hmm. So it's going to, as cities come closer and you have this sort of field in between them, Hatfield and McCoy sort of, that's our land, that's our land, that's our land. And so if you're getting it from the perspective of Lagash, of course, has agreed that this is Lagash's field, mm-hmm. and that they're renting it from Lagash, and that they didn't pay the rent that they were supposed to pay. And so that's why had to go fight them for it.
Yep.
Why Lagash had to go fight them for it. And Lagash is perfectly justified in doing that. It's a mandate of the gods why they do it. Right? Well, if you got which we don't have, but if you got account, they'd be saying, this is field, and Lagash is renting it out from and they trespass, and that's why we had to go to war against them. Okay. Well, the texts that we're getting are propagandistic, right? They're spun, right? Fake news. Mm-hmm. It's not that the historical, basic historical facts aren't, reliable in general. Like, is there a border conflict? Yeah. Is there a battle between them? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the specifics, how it plays out, why it plays out. Those are things that are spun.
Okay. I find it really ironic that he uses the Lagash conflict here. And he's right about some of this. Yes, the details are being spun. There is a propagandist element to the Lagash inscriptions. No doubt. Absolutely. Agree with that 100%. But it isn't the only agricultural war we see in the ancient Near East. It reminds me of another agricultural war between the Philistines and the Israelites, fighting over the Shephelah Valley. in the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, in the books of Kings and Chronicles. I somehow doubt that he's going to have the same generosity towards the Israelite-Philistine conflict that he has towards, say, the Lagash-Umma conflict. And we've got a lot more textual evidence and archaeological evidence for the conflict in the Shephelah Valley. Tel el-Safi, perfect example of this. Okay? So, that generosity towards the text is only going to extend so far. So there's a hypocrisy here. There's an intense hypocrisy here.
And we understand why. And nobody disputes that. However, when you come to the biblical text,
we don't
often notice that spin because we see this as a holy text.
I don't think it's fair. Being able to see, say, propagandistic elements in the Bible is not mutually exclusive to seeing it as a holy text. I mean, they're not. It's not, it's propagandistic, or it's a holy text. I mean, maybe some simple-minded people might think that, but you don't find that in mainstream scholarship. You don't find that in biblical scholarship. I mean, it's just ridiculous.
Okay. So what archaeology does is archaeology says, okay, let's look at something like the Exodus narrative, or let's look at something like the conquest account.
Yeah, let's look at those.
And, when...
Love to look at the Exodus narrative with you. In fact, I think there was an offer made once, as I recall. Several $100s were on the table to get you and I in the same room talking about this. I accepted that offer and you declined it. Now, ironically enough, you're about to have a debate with Sheffield and C.J. Cox. Are you getting paid that kind of money for this? Oh, I don't think so. You love punching down, don't you?
When biblical archaeologists 100 years ago were going out into Palestine and digging down and finding cities like Jericho and Ai and Hatzor and Megiddo and all these other cities that are important in the stories of the Hebrew Bible, they're digging down trying to confirm and defend. See how it matches up to what the Bible says. Well, as time went by and more data came in, it was that doesn't really match up very well. So
again, what that matches, the match is not against the Bible. The match was of a certain reading of the Bible. That whole sort of idea that all these cities were destroyed by the Israelite conquest. Well, the Israelite conquest isn't about destruction of all these cities in the land. It's about occupying. Basically, the Israelites came into the Promised Land and occupied existing cities, lived in their houses, ate their food, pruned their vineyards. And here's what I think is one of the big problems about, say, Josh's narrative here. He's got a reductionist view, and this probably comes from his fundamentalist upbringing, that sees only one interpretation of the Bible. And it's got to fit that one interpretation. Michael Heiser once said that a lot of fundamentalists end up falling away from the faith when they go to university because they just can't get past what they were taught in Sunday school. I think here we got another example of a scholar who never got past Sunday school. He's still carrying around with him the same simplistic view of the biblical text that he learned when he was 6 or 7. Some of us do grow beyond that. And should. We should grow beyond that. Your final view of the Bible should not be what you learned in Sunday school. Silly.
For example, the city of Ai is a great example of this. The city of Ai, which in Joshua 7, I think, undergoes this ambush and is destroyed. And it's supposed to be this, great city. And
who said it was a great city? The Bible doesn't say Ai was a great city. It was a city. Doesn't talk about being a great city or a big city. It had fortifications, and it had repelled the Israelites. And frankly, if Ai is your great example, you're going to have some issues there. The fact is, the current identification of Ai at 8 Tel is very controversial. There are people who are still debating over whether 8 Tel is really Ai. It might be. It might not be.
They initially, fight off the Israelites, but then they're ultimately defeated. Well, like archaeologists go out there and they dig down and they go, wait a minute, there's not even a city here at the end of the second millennium. In fact, there hasn't been a city here since it was destroyed in the middle of the third millennium.
So they're taking ruins. If you correct me if I'm wrong, they're taking ruins and writing a narrative as if they are the one. Like, it's almost like if you and me came across something living in America and we.
Okay. So what he's essentially doing here is using an absence of evidence. We've got this great example of Ai, which apparently nobody can agree upon. And it doesn't have evidence of occupation since the third millennium. Well, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It just isn't. And this is probably one of the big lessons that we've just learned from, say, the recent excavations at Jericho, is that there's a people living in the late Bronze Age or early Iron Age that took to the custom of site leveling, scraping off everything from the late Bronze Age to level a site for future construction. That's really going to change how we assess some of these sites now. There's an explanation of how you can have absence of evidence without actually showing that there wasn't an occupation. Absence of a city there isn't the only alternative. And in the case of Ai, because it's so controversial, could it be another site? Yeah, maybe. Could they have done site leveling at Ai? Possibly. That would get rid of the any sort of pre-existing mud brick structures that we'd find from the late Bronze Age. And we were now pretty confident that a lot of constructions from the late Bronze Age in Palestine were mud brick. So mud brick too has very poor preservation. It doesn't do well when it gets wet. It's not an enduring material in the same way as, say, the Middle Bronze fortifications were.
We're up here near Pennsylvania, Maryland. We found 1,000-year-old
Stonehenge. Use Stonehenge.
Okay,
I think that's great. Like any Hellboy, if you watch the Hellboy,
right?
But like the Hellboy 2, I just watched it a couple weeks ago. It might not have been Stonehenge, but it was something similar to that. Or Doctor Who uses it in the same way. Like, what do we think about Stonehenge? Well, there's got to be some alien aspect to it, or there's something that's otherworldly. There's some sort of something that we don't know about that's established this. And so, like that in Hellboy, that's where they're at. They're up in the Scottish Highlands or something, and there's these big rocks. It wasn't Stonehenge, but it was these big rocks, and they're trying to find this entrance to find the Golden Army. And they blow this whistle, and the rocks that are sort of spread out there come up out of the ground as this huge giant.
Right.
Okay. So, like, stories build up around these major monuments, these superstructures.
Okay. Now he's saying that the Bible is actually, these stories that grew up around these monuments, like the destructions at Jericho and Ai, etc.
Big ruins like that. This is what happens.
Right.
And if you don't know the background, and you, particularly if you're coming into intermittent contact with them as pastoral nomads, you're grazing your sheep and you're coming up on these ruins and you're looking at them and stories are being spun about what actually happened here. Mm-hmm. Legends can build up very easily about, and this is what's important about Canaan. If you look at throughout the early Bronze and Middle Bronze ages, you see that there's these periods of great expansion, monumental architecture, these huge buildings, huge walls, big fortifications. And then, famine hits or climate change, hits, and people can't sustain life inside those city walls anymore. And so they become more, they start to go out into pastoral nomadism, which is, you can seasonally migrate.
It's very ad hoc. He doesn't actually know that people went out from these small city-states to become pastoral nomads. They may have, but it's an ad hoc explanation. We don't have evidence for that. We do have evidence of the cities shrinking during the Middle Bronze Age. Yeah, that we got evidence for. We even find this in the Amarna letters, where, say, cities become so small and so undermanned that they have to appeal to Egypt for military support. But it's another thing, too, to say, well, this is the cause of, say, the building up of legends.
Great, and it's easier to survive that way. And so now these cities get abandoned. Well, now, a couple hundred years.
Very few of those cities got abandoned entirely. Part of the reason why is because most of those cities were near a water supply. Water was precious. They didn't just get abandoned. There had to be a reason for them to be abandoned. Through invasion, through conquest. People don't just abandon water supplies and wells in that area without a darn good reason. So, and really when we look at, say, the Amarna letters, we find surprising continuity where cities are not just abandoned. They're not just higgly-piggly abandoned. The people are killed or are forced to flee for a reason. It's not just that they abandoned these places, because these places had walls. These places had Middle Bronze fortifications. They were places of safety. You brought your herds inside the walls to protect them from other nomadic groups. So, I don't find this to be that compelling of an ad hoc explanation.
Years go by, these ruins are here, it's mud brick, or, the stones start to kind of fall down or whatever, and you look at it, people are looking at this thing, wow, look at these giant walls, these giant buildings. And stories start to develop about that. Well, giants must have built these things. Right?
Oh, I like this one. This one's funny. Okay. Joshua here is saying that these pastoral nomads come across these ruins, these big stones, and say, oh, giants must have built these. Giants were in the land building these huge city walls, and this is how we get giants in the Bible. Because they're making up these stories. That's where the legends come from. Well, Bowen doesn't know his historical sources all that well, obviously. Because the idea that giants lived in the land of Canaan long precedes most of, say, the giant narratives. We find this in Papyrus Anastasi 1, where it's said that the Shasu infested the land and could be 4 to 5 cubits in height. Essentially 6 to 7.5 feet. So there is a belief already existing at the time of Ramses II that there are giants in the land. Now, whether or not that's actually true is a whole nother matter. But you can't put the story of giants on the building up of legend over the years, because it's already part of, say, at least an ancient Near Eastern understanding of the inhabitants of Canaan. As I say, going back to at least Ramses II. So I don't think that's very credible. I think this is sort of mythicist spin.
Right. No, our ancestors actually destroyed these people.
Yes.
Because our God was on our side.
That's right. And so those things can be used to develop whatever narrative it is that you're trying to develop. So then that's why when an archaeologist goes...
It's reception history. Yes, of course they're trying to explain it according to what they understand about the universe, the world, and God. That's reception history.
And he digs a sounding, right? He digs down in several places on the site. And, she comes to the data and goes, whoa, the occupation layers that we see here, there is no occupation in the late Bronze Age, in the early Iron Age.
Absence of evidence. It's one of the great errors that the historian makes. David Hackett Fisher talks about this repeatedly in his book on historians' fallacies. The whole idea that we can say, well, there's nothing there, therefore there was no occupation there. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Archaeologists keep making that mistake. Historians keep making that mistake over and over and over and over again. If we don't have evidence, all it means is we cannot confirm the presence of it. Not that we can discount that there were people there at all. Just, that doesn't work. It is a historical fallacy.
I don't actually remember when Ai is repopulated, but the time of the destruction that's supposed to happen, nothing. Right? Hadn't been anything for more than 1,000 years.
But again, there's alternative explanations for that. And that's the problem with absence of evidence arguments. Is there's always alternative explanations. Maybe it's not I. Maybe there was site leveling. Maybe something else happened. The problem is there are alternative explanations, which is why we go by positive evidence, not negative evidence. Negative evidence is not evidence. It's nothing at all. It's nothing at all.
So then how do you engage with that sort of thing? Well, archaeology, like biblical archaeology, has moved. It's shifted. And so they're not, if you look at, you go to the Oriental Institute's website and you see these lectures by biblical archaeologists who are talking about the origins of Israel, the formation of Israel, or the early centuries of Israel, at late Bronze Age, early Iron Age. They're not concerned about we have to disprove the Bible or we have to prove the Bible.
No, they aren't.
Not
who cares?
Even, yeah.
It's not even on their mind. It's all right. We need to use the Hebrew Bible as a source because why wouldn't we use it as a source?
Right.
Because biblical maximalism has more or less pressed the issue. That's why you have to use it as a source. Because enough examples of where details were verified in the Bible have more or less swung that pendulum. We have to recognize that as a discipline. When the discipline of biblical archaeology started, almost everyone was a biblical maximalist. Okay, you hit the 1970s. Now almost everyone's a biblical minimalist. Now the pendulum is swinging back. So hopefully to a more middle position here, where it's not just as I said, when I was taking biblical archaeology at the University of British Columbia, my teacher said, you can't use the Bible at all. It was not acceptable as a source because there was nothing true in it. And it's biblical maximalism that has basically can be credited for the idea that, hey, there's some truth in it. So we should use it as a source.
In the same way that we'd want to use royal inscriptions as a source. But that doesn't mean that, you again, I always use Sargon's 8th campaign. You use it as a source to say things like, all right, well, it seems like there was a battle against Urartu. Well, here he talks about Urartu being fought. But that doesn't mean you then fill in the gaps and say, oh, okay, so the king himself ran ahead of his army because his army was slowing him down, and then you write the history based on how amazingly fast and powerful Sargon was. No.
And yet he has filled in the gaps of, say, the biblical narrative with his own understanding and interpretation of how that's supposed to be read. So he's really not quite treating it like, say, the Sargon narrative. He's not doing it. He's treating them like apples and oranges.
That's not how that works.
Yes, I agree. That's not how it works. And you shouldn't do that to the Bible either. Okay? You should approach it like you approach any other ancient text, which is on its own merits, on what it purports itself to be. You don't have to believe everything in it, but you should at least give it the dignity of actually being treated like other ancient texts.
And if the archaeology reveals that, hey, there was no destruction in the late Bronze Age and in the early Iron Age at this site, well then you have to rethink, why is it that this later text is telling this story about this conquest?
I love how he sort of excludes the middle here. He excludes the middle premise. Okay, so the archaeology doesn't show this site. So why we have to ask why this later text says that it does. Wait. You've already inserted in here, well, that missing premise of if it doesn't include, this archaeological site doesn't include that destruction layer, therefore the text is a later product. Okay? That's excluding the middle premise, and it's a logical fallacy. It's a logical fallacy. He has to exclude that premise to get to the next step in his argument. So, it's not exactly valid. And that's, again, because there could be other reasons why we don't find that, including archaeological error. You're not likely to miss a destruction layer on a site, but it is possible to misidentify a site. It has happened. One of the most famous was Pierre Montet, when Pierre Montet claimed to have found the city of Pyramses. Well, it wasn't Pyramses, it was Tanis. He was wrong, but there was a misidentification there, because mistakes happen, even when the evidence seems pretty good. I mean, Montet found all those inscriptions of blocks that had been taken from Pyramses, so he had warrant to believe it. But it became clear over time that those blocks weren't carved in situ, in place. They had been relocated from another site, and many of them turned on their side. So, just because you don't find the physical destruction layer doesn't necessarily mean you can jump to the conclusion it's a later text.
And I think the failing of people that are still trying to argue, there's a book on the shelf, I can't remember the guy that wrote, Kennedy is his name.
Yeah, I wouldn't recommend that book. I wouldn't recommend Kennedy's approach. Again, Kennedy is approaching this through the same sort of lens that Sunday school Josh Bowen does. essentially through that lens of, say, American fundamentalism. Yeah, I would totally agree with Josh here. I wouldn't recommend Titus Kennedy's book either. I think Titus Kennedy has some very sloppy scholarship. I don't think he's a good historian, at least. He might be a fine archaeologist. I don't know about that. But he's not a good historian. And what we're talking about here is in the domain of the historian.
Evangelical Christian who's essentially, I haven't read it all the way through, but just from what I looked at,
he's more than an evangelical.
Like trying to, salvage the archaeological data and say, well, actually it can fit, right? As Joel Baden would say, like, miss me with that shit, right? Like, that's not what we're supposed to be doing. It's not what biblical archaeologists are supposed to be doing. It's, you look at sources of information for writing history, for doing historiography, and you say, how can, like the rake and shovel method, right? You rake in the good stuff, shovel out the bad stuff.
I don't necessarily disagree here with Josh on using archaeology as sources for writing history. In fact, I think that is the proper application of archaeological data. I just would disagree with him on what he rakes and what he shovels. I think he's a little indiscriminate about the shovel and not so thorough about the raking. So, again, he's looking at this through the same 6-year-old Sunday school kid fundamentalist lens. And if he wants to throw that out, that's okay. But he is throwing out the baby with the bathwater.
You don't start with the premise that this is a holy text, this is an inspired text, and until proven otherwise, we assume that it's right.
I'm not starting with that premise. However, I do think that if I should believe that, that doesn't necessarily reflect upon my archaeological data. Here's the thing. We all have a bias. I have a bias, and I freely admit it. I believe in the Bible. I believe it's an inspired, inerrant text, at least in its autographs. I believe that. But I also recognize that I believe that. I'm not pretending I don't have a bias here.
I don't think that's the way to go.
Well, of course you don't think that's the way to go, because you've abandoned that idea long ago. 6-year-old Sunday school mind just sort of rejected it. Okay, fair enough. And I don't think the two interfere with each other. I think you can be a perfectly competent archaeologist and still hold to faith propositions. I don't see the conflict here.
If you want to start that way, like, it is what it is. I think that's how, it's definitely how it was done. It was assumed that it was right.
Would you say Hoffmeyer, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like, Hoffmeyer does tremendous work. Kenneth Kitchen does tremendous work as Egyptologists. But then when they come into these areas of investigation, I mean, I think that...
You mean like how you come into these areas of investigation? Okay, you're criticizing James Hoffmeyer as an Egyptologist who comes into the area of biblical archaeology, when you're doing the exact same thing as an Assyriologist coming into biblical archaeology. If his approach isn't valid, your approach isn't valid. Sauce for the goose, sauce for the gander.
Their theological commitments.
You have theological commitments. I mean, you've been very, very public. I mean, your whole book, the Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament, is one big theological commitment. It's not a theistic theological commitment. It's an atheistic theological commitment, but it's no less a theological commitment. So, there's hypocrisy here. Lots and lots and lots of hypocrisy.
Color their research, right?
Just like it colors your research. Except they're upfront about it. You're not.
And when I talk to other Egyptologists about this, they'll say, yeah, Hoffmeyer does great work, and I hate.
Yeah, well, there are other Egyptologists too that don't have a problem with this. So don't just say that. Don't just spread the broad brush here that say, oh, Egyptologists think Hoffmeyer does great work, but it'd be better without those theological commitments. I don't think that's universally true of Egyptologists. Maybe the ones you hang around, like Maggie Bryson, right? She would hold that view, but it's not something that's sort of universally across the board. And much of this is because there are many Egyptologists who have theological commitments that are not necessarily Christian. A good number of Egyptologists are Muslim. You can't tell me they don't have theological commitments.
Using people's names like that,
no,
but I think it's appropriate here because it'd be about the Exodus. But they're brilliant scholars. There's no question. But when you get into these areas where I think that they have a tension with their theological commitments and what they think about this text, and the archaeological or historical data, and they go like, I think that the way they come at it is not the way that I would come at it, and it's not the way that I think most scholars come at it.
You're right. Absolutely. With my theological commitments, I'm not going to come at the text the same way you do. I'm not going to come with a approach that automatically is going to attack the text. I'm not going to take that approach. Now, I'm also very, very open about the fact that my interpretations about the text, how I read the text, can be very, very mistaken. I recognize my limits here. I am liable to make mistakes. I'm liable to misread the text. And that's because I understand myself and I'm reflective about my own abilities to read the text. I'm not coming at this from a fundamentalist mindset that says there's only one way to read the text. So, yeah, my theological commitment is going to color how I read the text, which is, I'm going to doubt maybe how I read the text. Maybe I misunderstand what's being written in the text. That could happen. I am not going to say it's all debunked automatically. Now, there may come a point where I do find a section of the text where I say, okay, this can't be reconciled with the evidence. I might come to that point. Absolutely, it's possible. I haven't gotten there yet. But at least I'm open to saying that. I don't see the reverse commitment basically saying, yeah, if I get all this evidence, I'll commit to the text. Whose theological commitment here is stronger? My theistic theological commitment or Josh Bowen's atheistic theological commitment? I think his is stronger, actually. He's very committed to this. He'll jump to a conclusion based on his theological commitment or his atheological commitment. It's still a theological commitment, though.
I think it's better that you get people, like you said, who are going to approach it like they would any other royal inscription from some other, I think you're right. Because then,
absolutely, you should approach the Bible like any other ancient Near Eastern text. Give it the benefit of the doubt that it is actually what it purports to be. But you don't.
It doesn't allow you're weighing in one side more than the other.
You don't want to, I don't think you want to.
Then again, too, you know what? If I read an ancient text, let's say a Sumerian king list, I'll be the first person to say, I don't understand how the early dating system of the reigns of those kings worked. I'm not going to say that, well, it reads 28,000 years, therefore it's lying. No, I wouldn't say that about the Sumerian kings list. I'll say I don't understand how they're coming up with those numbers. But admitting I don't understand is a very, very different proposition than saying, oh, it's just propaganda and lies. It's a very different proposition. So I don't think he's really approaching both sets of texts, say the biblical and the non-biblical text, in the same manner.
Approach any ancient text and say, hey, we're going to think it's all wrong until we have archaeological or whatever, textual, anything, confirmation. Things that show it to be true. I don't think that's the right way to go about it.
Right.
On the other hand, I don't think you go, all right, we're going to assume this is all true for the most part until we have evidence that disproves it. I don't think that's a good way to go. There's this sort of happy medium where you say, all right, I'm going to use, I come to this text and I say, okay, what genre is this text? All right, it seems like...
Well, you know what? Good biblical Protestant scholars do exactly that. This is called the grammatical historical method. The first thing we do is we read the text to find the genre. Where'd you get that from? You got that from Dom Calmet. In 300 years ago. You're basing your method of reading texts on essentially a religious methodology by scholars who were biased by their faith commitments. Yeah. Spare me.
There's some supernatural, mythological, legendary things that are in it, and so maybe we start on that with that premise that, okay, it's probably okay to assume that there's some historical reality behind it, some kernel of historical reality behind it.
You mean there's some historical reality behind some of possibly some of these biblical texts?
But, all right, let's go investigate. We don't want to assume that all of it's right. And then as you excavate these...
Well, one of the things I think we've learned out of 200 years of biblical scholarship is we cannot necessarily say that we're reading it right. Why does it have to be, well, we assume it's all right, or we don't assume it's all right? That's a black and white sort of fallacy here. That's a false dichotomy. There's other options. Again, are we reading it correctly? I mean, the one thing that 200 years of biblical scholarship has shown us is we don't necessarily read the text correctly. There are things that change over time as far as what we learn about, say, the language and the context that alter our readings of this. It doesn't have to be in it, it's wrong or it's all right. That's a false choice.
Cities, and you go, okay, well, sure shit seems like, as I always like quoting Bill Deaver, but he says I think 38 of the 40 sites that the conquest talks about don't fit the archaeological data. They don't fit what the narrative has. And so
interestingly enough, Bill Deaver also comes from a fundamentalist background. He's another guy who could not escape his 6-year-old Sunday school training. The 38 out of 40 sites that he quotes, most of those were never said to have been destroyed. So, yeah, what are you expecting to find at those sites? Constant occupation. Very few sites in the Joshua narrative were actually destroyed with fire, at least claimed to have been destroyed with fire. Now, maybe some of them were. Maybe there are other cities other than Hatzor, Jericho, and Ai that were claimed to have been destroyed with fire. But they're not written in the Bible if that's what happened to them. So to make this claim it doesn't fit the narrative, well, what's your perception of the narrative? If your perception is that Joshua came in and burned every city he encountered, then of course it's not going to match that, because you're misreading the text. If you misread the text, you're going to get a wrong result. Garbage in, garbage out.
2 out of 40 that's not very good.
And one of them I think that did fit was like they saw that it had been burned.
Yeah.
And it's like,
yeah.
I mean, how many places when you go to destroy get burnt? Or they might have, I mean, it's just like
just
yeah, you see, Derek is just saying that those places you destroy get burned. How many of them, yeah, they weren't destroyed. They were occupied. And one of those cities is Hatzor that was destroyed with fire, and we do have a very good archaeological evidence for that. The other two have site issues. Jericho has site leveling. We do find traces of a late bronze destruction there, which is documented by Garstang. He notes 2 destruction layers there. One was later re-identified as being the destruction layer of the Middle Bronze fortifications. And the Middle Bronze fortifications would never have worked either for, say, the Joshua narrative either, because it's really, really clear from, say, the text that it's referring to, say, a later kind of fortification, not a Middle Bronze fortification. So, with site leveling happening at Jericho, it's going to be tough. But Lorenzo Nigro has already ruled out an early late bronze 2A destruction, so that only leaves the 2B.
Because Hatzor has this destruction layer that fits the timeline. And I think there's even some contention. Again, it's not my field, but I think there's even some contention about that. But assuming that it fits perfectly.
It does.
All that is it's not disconfirming.
Absolutely. It's not disconfirming. Yes. It's not disconfirming. But it is what we would expect. So, may not be disconfirming, which is a double negative. Not disconfirming. That means it's actually confirming. I love the play with the double negatives here. We don't want to admit it confirms, so it does not disconfirm. The word games. Josh is good on the word games.
Right. That's the key. And it, like, cities get burned all the time.
That's what I was going to say. So it doesn't require...
Yeah, but most of the time when a city gets burned, people do make a good faith effort to try to put out the fire. You don't have normally entire cities go down in flames. Yes, fires can get out of control. It happened to Rome. Accidents happen. But it also, when the whole city burns down like that, there's usually a little more going on. And there's a lot of suspicion, say, in say, even the burning of Rome, that it wasn't exactly accidental. So, cities do burn down. But they also get destroyed and burned too.
Or the Israelites themselves.
Exactly.
And it might have been a Canaanite thing that happened at the time that was carried over. Or, there's so many ways that you can...
Could Hatzor have been destroyed by another Canaanite? Well, possible. It's possible. Is it likely? Well, the only textual account we have is, say, the book of Joshua. That does seem to at least lend some credence that there's at least some evidence here that it wasn't Canaanite. Because it is the only testimony we have of it.
Look at it.
Yeah.
So, to put it simply, because we could go on and on, I'm sure, and this is a topic that I'd love to get like Dr. William Deaver on one day. And
Yes,
talk
that
to
would be
him about.
amazing. He could do this so much better than I could.
It's really cool though hearing you. I
Yeah.
like to get different scholars who.
William Deaver has shifted his views a little on this. So, he might go into automatic mode. He might confirm everything that, Josh says here. That's possible, Get him up on a lectern and he tends to go into automatic mode like that. But he's in private, he does tend to temper his views a bit more. At least he has recently. He has when him and I have had coffee at Azor.
Talk about this, even though this isn't your particular wheelhouse, you've done these things to some extent. I just wanted to kind of like say, if you had to pick which one for trying to understand the reality, archaeology or the Bible, it sounds like archaeology has way more tools within its wheelhouse because it's not just pulling from the biblical source. See, archaeology isn't just archaeology.
Again, here we've got another false choice. Choose between archaeology and the Bible. Choose. This is just patterns of evidence, atheist version. What? Huh? Archaeology or the Bible. Choose. Well, choose archaeology because it's got a lot more tools. This is just the atheist version of patterns of evidence. It's just silly. Christianity's been plagued with bad methodology and in its popular works, but popular atheism also has its sort of lunatic approaches, and I think this is a perfect example of it.
Using the Bible as well as using any other ancient Near Eastern source. To try and draw what may or may not have happened in reality. Whereas if you look at the Bible, you're only getting one propagandistic position.
Who's recommending you only use the Bible? Maybe from a fundamentalist lens, maybe. You do have people who do practice nuda scriptura, like the Campbellites. They practice nuda scriptura. They don't consult anything but the Bible. But Western Christian scholars don't do that. They take all of these sources. They don't just take the Bible. This idea that Christian scholars just take the Bible is patently ridiculous. Nobody does that.
And if you start as a Christian, you're not going to say propagandistic. You're going to think purely reality. This is true history. You'd go...
Wait a minute. Who basically, who's he talking about here? These Christians who just take the Bible and don't think at all that none of it is propagandistic? Who's he talking about here? He's not talking about mainstream scholarship. He's talking some fringe element. I'm more than willing to accept that, hey, there's a propagandistic element in the Bible. Absolutely. We do see this in, let's say, the use of genealogies, where sometimes things are referred obliquely because it is politically sensitive. There's a propagandistic element to, say, the Davidic monarchy. Nobody questions that, even in mainstream Christian scholarship. So I don't know who he's talking about here, but it isn't Christian scholars.
Heard Christians almost laugh when Dr. Price would say, well, if the Exodus happened, it seems like God sent his angels down with vacuum cleaners to clean up the mess. So there was no...
He absolutely should be laughed at. Because again, it's a 6-year-old Sunday school conception of the Exodus. And it's a sort of a 6-year-old, joke that doesn't seriously engage with the archaeology or the history. So Price should be laughed at for that.
Evidence of it.
Right.
At least as described in the Bible. So you got to go...
Again, how is the Bible describing it? If I asked Robert Price, how is the Bible describing the Exodus? I bet you I'd get one heck of a weird answer that has nothing to do with what is actually in the text. Because I've heard him talk about this. He has almost no idea what's in the text.
Are you going to believe that God hid the evidence, or Satan's trying to deceive everyone, so he hides the evidence? I mean, how silly do you have to get?
There is a quote that...
It's not a matter of hiding the evidence. It's a preservation matter. The whole Nile Delta preserves very, very little text. Very, very little evidence. There's a preservation issue there that real archaeologists understand. Real Egyptologists understand that the Nile Delta is terrible at preserving things. It's these fringe scholars like Price who wants to come in and say, oh, well, God sent all this stuff down during the Exodus and then swept it up with vacuum cleaners. That's silliness. Because it pays no attention to the actual Egyptological material or the conditions under which it has survived.
I use all the time, and I think, watch, I won't be able to find the book, as I never can find the book.
You always find the books. What do you mean?
I know, but it always takes me 10 minutes. There it is. It's an old 1987 scripture meaning and method, but there's this article in here by Lester Graby, and he has this amazing quote, and I think it fits beautifully here. And I just have to find it, 133, because I use it in my book, and I don't know, it just sums up so well. He's talking about fundamentalists. It's a great article. But he's talking about fundamentalists, and
great cinematography there.
Sorry, where is it?
What page is that?
I'm trying to find where the quote is specifically, because he sums it up. Here it is. Okay. In his conclusion, it's on page 148. What I have attempted to demonstrate here is not that one way of understanding the book of Daniel is somehow the right one. So he's talking about aspects of the dating of the book of Daniel. On the contrary, scholarship is always pushing beyond today's status quo, probing, challenging, applying new data and new theory. What I have been trying to show is that, despite noises to the contrary, fundamentalism is incompatible with scholarship. Fundamentalism has already determined its conclusions. It is not seeking because it already knows the answer. If it has good evidence on its side which supports the Bible, it uses it. If it has little data, it twists and interprets what it has to support the Bible. If it has no evidence, it hypothesizes that such will eventually be found. And of course, no amount of contrary evidence is sufficient. Fundamentalism can never conclude that the Bible is wrong.
Now, he's talking about Christian fundamentalism here. That's not the only type of fundamentalism. The same criticisms can be applied to atheistic fundamentalism. Atheistic fundamentalists have already assumed that the Bible is wrong. They've already assumed that it cannot be proven. They've already assumed that the text is wrong when it is actually a reading of the text, an interpretation of the text. These guys are fundamentalists. They're just not theistic fundamentalists. They're atheistic fundamentalists. Just as religious, just as zealous, just as parochial. And this is why I can't take take this seriously. Because it's already arrived at the conclusion it's set out to prove. It's done exactly what Lester Gravy has accused Christian fundamentalism of. Except in the case of Christian fundamentalism, it's doing it to prove the Bible. Yeah. This is why I think it's... This is why I just can't take logical fallacy and poor methodology and poor historical method, seriously, even when it comes out of the mouth of an atheist. I can't take it seriously when it comes out of the mouth of a Christian fundamentalist. I can't take it seriously when it comes out of the mouth of a atheistic fundamentalist. Same problem. Same results. Same poor scholarship.
Wow. Well said. Thank you, Dr. Josh. Of course.
And now we end the video with a rogues gallery of skeptics and atheists. We have Francesca Stravakalopoulou, who's a well-known skeptic. Of course, pitching Josh Bowen's self-published book. Bad method will travel. Then we got Joel Baden. He might be a future popcorn video, we'll see. And then, of course, we have Aaron Raw. I mean, here's the perfect example of a guy who not only just, never got past his 6-7-year-old Sunday school fundamentalism, but, puts up a temper tantrum every time he wants to debate it. So, yes, his screaming fits are infamous. So here we got the rogues gallery. All right. Now, that ends our popcorn review of Does Archaeology Bury the Bible with Dr. Joshua Bowen. Yeah, like usual, we see here a lot of poor methodology, bad logic, just terrible scholarship all around, a lot of slippery language. So, this was the video that you all demanded, that I actually do a popcorn review of one of Digital Hammurabi's videos. Yeah, I don't think anyone needs to be concerned here. I don't think that they made a compelling case that archaeology and the Bible are mutually incompatible. I don't think they made that case at all. So anyway, thank you very much for watching. I hope you appreciated this video and you learned something. And I'll see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.